Hey everybody, this is Gary Fong, and it is the anniversary of the Apollo 11th moon launch. I'm seeing so many things across my feed saying, "Wow, what an amazing achievement, man landing on the moon!" And I couldn't let that go without kind of chiming in, as a professional photographer, some of the problems that I saw with the photographs that were purportedly taken on the moon. I do have an issue with it, and I'll show you what the different inconsistencies are, and then you can decide for yourself. Because I'm not here to say that we didn't land on the moon. That requires direct knowledge. And the only people that know if we landed on the moon or not would be the people that were actually there. Everything else is hearsay. We either heard or we saw articles or videos of, or photographs of the moon launch and landing and things like that. But so I'm going to do this in a different way and just basically ask questions from a technical perspective, from a professional. How could these photographs actually exist from the moon? Now, I'm saying that as an expert because I was a professional photographer for 20 years, and I shot most of my career with Hasselblad cameras. So I know these cameras inside and out. I know how to load the film in the dark. I know how to operate it, and I even know the sound that the camera makes if there's a problem with the leaf shutter. And I'm not alone. There's a lot of photographers who photographed millions of exposures with Hasselblad cameras. And for those of you very valued professionals, seasoned professionals who are experts in Hasselblads, you'll probably appreciate this a tiny bit more because I'm going to go into a little bit of technical detail explaining why these photographs from the moon probably didn't come from the moon. Now, not only was I a professional photographer who used Hasselblad cameras, I was also sponsored by Hasselblad as a visiting lecturer for Hasselblad University. And I also was the operator of Pictage Incorporated, the largest pro digital film lab in the United States at the time. And so I know a lot about handling of film, how it's processed. I know a lot about film characteristics. And I know a lot about the Ektachrome 160 film that they shot on the moon. And therefore, I can talk meaningfully about why the camera probably didn't 100% impossible with the camera that I actually held, the decommissioned Moon camera that I held in my hands. Absolutely could not have delivered those images, and we'll go into that now. So this is a decommissioned lunar surface. They basically, what they did was they took cameras to the moon, and then they pulled off the film magazines, and then they left the cameras on the moon because they're very limited payload in terms of weight. They could either bring moon rocks back or cameras. They didn't really care about the cameras, so they left the cameras there. This is a decommissioned camera, and there's a few of them. I think they only brought one camera back from the moon. Most of the other cameras were left there. This is the story they tell, if in fact they were actually on the moon surface at all. But let me just talk about the camera. The first thing about this camera that I notice is it's a remarkably similar to the off-the-shelf 500 ELM camera at the time with a 50mm Zeiss, I think it's T-Star f5.6 lens. What made this camera slightly different is that they pulled all the leather, the cosmetic leather off it. So it was, from what I could tell, it was a bare metal camera. The film back, normally, which is a 70mm film back, this was a 200 exposure film back, which, kind of makes sense. Changing film magazines in the middle of a lunar walk doesn't make sense to me, not with, the big gloves and whatnot. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is how come this isn't weather sealed? How come there's all these holes and crevices, like right here in the dark slide, micro dust can get inside there, go between the film plectrum and the lens, dust up the lens, and really screw things up. So I didn't know how that worked. The other thing too is when I saw the actual camera, and I've seen it a number of times at the Smithsonian, at Photokina, is when you look at it, there's a number of things that absolutely do not make sense if you are a knowledgeable professional photographer who has shot with Hasselblads. So, number one is this. Okay, so caution, do not touch the glass surface. That glass surface that they're talking about is called a reso plate, and that reso plate gave the little squares that they used later, that they said they used later for positioning, distances between things, although you could overlay the squares on top of the actual photograph and do the same thing. But the other thing that was really kind of interesting is what I saw here was the remove dark slide. Now the remove dark slide warning here, it says remove dark slide before installing the magazine. Now if you are in fact a Hasselblad photographer, you'll know that the dark slide has to be in when you take off or remove the film magazine from the camera. And the reason that's the case is because the dark slide protects the film from being exposed as you're taking the film magazine on and off. Doesn't that make sense? You don't want to expose the film or fog the rest of it while you take it off or put it back on, because that's film, right? It's sensitive to light and temperature, which we'll get to in a second. But so that's the reason why you have to have the dark slide in. In fact, in a Hasselblad camera, you cannot mount the film magazine without the dark slide being in. There's a button on top, and it'll catch it. It will not engage, and you cannot mount or take it off without the dark slide being in. So this thing here about remove dark slide before installing magazine, that was really strange. When you are a professional at anything and someone hands you a piece of equipment that is weird, you're going to say this is weird. Like if you're a race car driver and you're driving a Ferrari and it has 1, 2, 3, and 5th gear, but 4th gear is missing, you're going to say, whoa, something's really weird about that, right? It's just weird. So this, being a very, very seasoned professional photographer and kind of an equipment nerd, caught me really off guard. I thought that was just really strange. So the other thing that I thought was weird is Hasselblad, or NASA, screwed, you can see a screw right here. They literally screwed on these levers so that the astronauts can turn the shutter speed dial. They're locked together, so the shutter speed and the aperture dial were locked together so that they would go in unison. And that makes sense because the exposure is set by what's called an exposure value. An exposure value is the equivalent, like say for example, 1/500th of a second is equal to f5.6 is equal to 1/250th of a second at f8. An exposure value stays the same, but like a slide rule, you can move that around, keep the same exposure, but you're just changing the shutter speed and the aperture while you're doing it. So I thought that was kind of cool, except for the case that if you are shooting on the moon with a 50mm lens, which is a very, very wide angle lens, infinity is probably anywhere from 2 feet ahead at f16. It's almost infinite depth of field. So for them to screw it in, lock the two, but then make them movable, man, that's a disaster, because look what happened to this poor shot right here. 1/4 of a second at f16. Now, that's blurry, but ridiculously overexposed. What they should have been was locked down at 1/250th of a second at f16. Okay, so that's completely wrong. But this puppy is screwed in and dialed in. That didn't make sense to me. And again, I'm talking about if you were a race car driver and you got in and said the tachometer only goes up to 1,000 RPM, you would think something's really weird. Now, why is it like that? Are they signaling you with something, or was Hasselblad just like, whoa, we just blew it so bad? It just doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. But also what really doesn't make sense, and I'm going to ask you this, just common sense here. If NASA publishes that in direct sunlight, the temperature on the surface of the moon reaches a boiling 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while nighttime temperatures, in other words, when they're on the dark side of the moon, go down to minus 208 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. 250 degrees will boil water. You've got slide film. I don't know if you've ever left film so many of you have never even experienced film, but if you've left film in a glove compartment on a hot day, you'll expose the film. Okay, so not only will you expose the film, but the film can decrystallize and melt. Regardless, that it's not going to be good for the film to be shot or in an environment of 250 degrees. And this source right here is NASA itself. Okay, so NASA is telling you that the temperature on the surface of the moon is a boiling hot 250 degrees. With that, we're going to take a non-insulated camera and walk around on the moon, and it's not weather protected for dust, which would completely ruin the camera, the shutter mechanism, and everything like that. And this is what really I thought was weird. It said the film had an S-tar polyester base which had a melting point of 254 degrees Celsius or 490 degrees Fahrenheit. So anyway, I put this up here and I said, this is really weird, everyone, but as a professional photographer, how could they have ever brought back slide film after an excursion on the surface of the moon for about half an hour in boiling temperature, hot enough to boil water? I put that on, unfortunately, this wound up on Kennedy Space Center's thing, and it wound up on my Facebook, and I put it on there, and it had to be 1,000 angry responses from the... Okay, so I just want to share this with you because you got to see... I'm starting to realize what's called confirmation bias, where people, they look things up to try to confirm their bias, right? Okay, so this guy here writes, nonsense, there is no temperature in space. NASA just said there's 250 degrees temperature. But I do understand what he's saying. Out in the middle of space, in a vacuum, where there is nothing for radiation energy to energize the molecules, to rub them together, to create heat, which is called radiation. It's thermodynamics. So there's three ways to heat an object. One is radiation, second one is conduction, and the other one is convection. So conduction would be just touching things together, right? So you touch your hand on a hot plate, and that's conduction. And it's, wow, that's hot, okay? Convection is when there's a liquid around that actually lifts the temperature or transfers the kinetic motion of this excitation energy of rubbing molecules together from one object to the other. So this guy looked up something and said, in space there's no temperature because it's a vacuum. This is correct because there are no molecules to rub together. Bravo, you're so smart. That's not the case here because a camera is an object that has molecules. So when it is exposed to radiation energy, guess what? The camera gets hot. So this guy says the temperature of an object in space depends on irradiation density, albedo. Albedo. I had to look that one up because very few people know what albedo is. And albedo basically means the reflectivity of an object, such as a piece of paper or planet or whatever. So it's albedo. Hey, baby. I'm so smart. I like the albedo of your white dress. Anyway, okay, so to increase albedo, the camera was covered by a white envelope. Oh, really, was it? Where did he see that? This greatly reduces the temperature of the camera, but if it's in space, the camera has no temperature, according to you. Water, for example, boils at room temperature in a vacuum. There is no temperature in space. Water boils at room temperature in a vacuum. Smart guy. And then, is it the same guy? No, a different guy says, well, the temperatures went even higher, maybe 340. The thing is, being actual scientists, they use the Kelvin scale, which you've never even heard of. Really? That's kind of weird. I have a degree in pharmacology from the University of California. You've never even heard of, which makes 250 about 9.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So 340 K is a bit warmer than 9.5 degrees at 170 degrees Fahrenheit. As to the length of the lunar day, have you ever seen phases of the moon? All you've got to do is look at the thing, as people have been doing for millennia. You think you're sticking it to the man when really you are just displaying astounding levels of ignorance. Oh, I've never heard of the Kelvin scale. So here's what he was saying. It's like he's saying It's 250 degrees Fahrenheit. But because they're scientists, they use Kelvin, which is therefore about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it wouldn't have even gotten hot. Okay, so I said, okay, so this is like me saying I weigh 180 pounds, but since I live in Canada where we use kilograms, I actually weigh 82 kilograms, so I'm really light. I said, that's what you just did. You changed the units, reasoning that K is what scientists use, but kept the value the same. Okay, so that's like going to the doctor and the doctor saying, your temperature is 98.6 degrees. And he says, I don't understand that. I'm a scientist. Can you give that to me in Kelvin? So I'm learning a lot about confirmation bias, is that people, first thing that happens in their process is they get mad that I dare question that we've even been to the moon. I didn't say I questioned that we've ever been to the moon. I'm just saying that those photographs did not come from the moon. They absolutely did not come from the moon. And if they didn't come from the moon, then where did they come from? A film set? I don't know. The other problem is that's a motorized camera, which had nickel-cadmium batteries. We didn't have lithium-ion batteries then. We had NiCads. And the thing is, NiCads can safely reach 40 degrees Celsius without damage, which is about 100 and maybe 100 degrees. Okay, any more than that, then it can explode. So now you've got it in. I want you to do me a favor. I want those of you who are really skeptics, I want you to take a battery, a NiCad battery, maybe lithium-ion. They're better for heat, but put it in boiling water, and you tell me if it explodes. Let me know how that goes. The other thing too that was really kind of iffy about the story of this Ektachrome 160 film coming from the moon. Now again, I'm not going to expand outside of it. As we say in court, we say that we are going to focus on the issues within the four corners of the document. I'm here to talk about the film. Did it come from the moon or not? And I'm saying there's problems with how it's represented to us. And as a person with a background in science and physics and photography and a lab processor, I'm saying that film did not come from the moon and was exposed here. The other thing too is X-rays. X-rays occur on the moon. High-level X-rays, and so when those of you did you remember film, and you would have to put it through the TSA machine, but a lot of people would want to take the film out so it wouldn't get exposed in X-rays. Do you remember that? Or are we so far into digital now? Those of you who do remember that we took our film out over ISO 400. Because that was very more light sensitive, made it more X-ray sensitive. We took it out because we didn't want to get it exposed to X-rays. Unfortunately, there's a lot of X-rays on the moon. How much X-rays are on the moon? They don't even know if an astronaut can survive it. It says lunar astronauts could be harmed by X-ray outbursts from the sun. And it's an X-ray danger. That's really weird because we've had like 8 manned landings on the moon. I don't know how many astronauts have actually been on it, maybe 12, 16 or something like that. But we now know in January of 2007 that moon astronauts may face X-ray danger. Well, if they may face X-ray danger, then the film definitely faced X-ray danger. But then I started to research a little bit more, about these Van Allen belt particles, and there's a band of radiation that's impossible for anyone to pass through and live. And so I thought, that's really kind of weird, especially now that NASA has just announced that they're sending two mannequins to the moon. Why? NASA will send artificial females to the moon to study the risks of radiation. Well, my goodness, did we not have a whole bunch of men just walking around on the moon, leaving their footprints all over the place? 2 artificial female bodies called Helga and Zohar will be sent to the moon. According to NASA, they travel around the Earth's satellite and for the first time measure radiation risks to women's bodies before the crews fly there. So, my boobies, my fallopian tubes are getting radiated. I'm just being silly, but why is NASA sending mannequins to the moon 50 years later after so many men walked around the moon to the point that we stopped going? How many times has the U.S. landed on the moon? 6 crewed missions to the moon landed a total of 12 astronauts, all men, from 69 to 72, and a series of Apollo missions numbering up to Apollo 17. Okay, so that's basically what they are. So Helga and Zohar are these artificial crash test dummy female robots that were conducted with NASA, the creator of the Special Protection Vest. This is considered the largest experiment made for studying radiation exposure related to astronauts outside low Earth orbit. So, we are trying to find out if people can live and survive on a moon landing 50 years later after we landed on the moon. And again, so back to my topic. This photograph, impossible. Implausible to impossible. 9.995 on the 10 scale of bullshit. That film could have come back from the moon looking like that and even delivering any kind of exposure. Those of you who are knowledgeable about this, please comment. And
stage push. Engine arm is S. Okay, I'm going to get the pro. 99 proceeded. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Right away, Houston. Regs are good.